A hidden map in a widow's Bible. Secrets buried in Scripture. Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Ravella. Tell me, where are you joining from today? Your voices make this mystery come alive. Now the story begins. A raw October fog had laid its damp shroud upon Baker Street, so that even the lamps burned like sullen eyes, and the rattle of wheels came to us as through wet wool. I had come to share a late breakfast with my old friend when Mrs. Hudson knocked, ushering into the sitting room a lady of middle years whose mourning, though scrupulously plain, could not hide the quality of her bearing. Behind her stood a clergyman with the pale, earnest look of one who has too often rehearsed discouraging news, and last of all Inspector Lestrade. His hat in his hand and a gust of chill air at his back. "You see, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade without preamble, "I have brought them straight to you. There's a theft, possibly worse, and the thing is about as tidy as a knotted skein." Holmes, who had been leaning in the wicker chair with the old clay pipe between his fingers and an attitude of languid indifference, sat forward with that bird-like quickness which never failed to thrill me. "Pray be seated," he said. "Inspector, you honor us. Madam Dr. Watson. You are cold and you are not accustomed to London fogs. Mrs. Hudson, the fire, if you please." The lady bowed. "I am Mrs. Eliza Harrow of Porchester Terrace," she said in a voice that tried for steadiness and fell short. "This is the Reverend Mr. Ellison, our minister at St. Matthew's. My husband, Captain Nathaniel Harrow of the late Royal Navy Chart Office, was laid to rest on Monday. Yesterday I scarcely know how to tell it." "The facts, madam," said Holmes gently. "The feelings we shall not neglect. But the facts first. At the reading of my husband's will," the clergyman put in, "which I conducted at the house for the convenience of the family, Mrs. Harrow brought down the large family Bible that has lain upon their parlor table since her marriage. Captain Harrow, it appears, had placed certain private memoranda in its leaves. We opened it together, at which there fell from between the Book of Ruth and 1 Samuel a folded strip of vellum. Not paper, sir. A vellum lined upon one side and marked upon the other with a sketch." "A map," said Holmes. "Precisely a map," said Mrs. Harrow, clasping her gloved hands. "A little map no larger than a lady's hand, with the lines drawn in Captain Harrow's own sure pen. There was a small red cross at one corner, and in my husband's hand a single word, widow. It seemed some horrid jest upon my bereavement, Mr. Holmes, and I confess I fainted. When I awoke, the servants were in a flutter, the neighbors at the railings, and the Reverend had folded the thing again and placed it back in the Bible." "As I thought best," Ellison murmured. "Quite," said Holmes. "And afterwards?" "It was agreed," Lestrade put in, "that the Bible should go back upon the table under the lady's own eye while I made a few inquiries. Captain Harrow had once been connected, so I learn, with Admiralty soundings off our east coast. Anything that smells of charts is apt to grow into a tale for sailors' ears, and sailors' ears are oft connected to sticky fingers. I had scarcely got as far as the corner of Bathurst Mews when a woman screams from the Harrow parlor. We return helter-skelter, and there's the Bible open and the vellum gone." "Gone?" I cried. "Vanished," said Lestrade. "Window fastened, door watched, servants white as sheets, and the lady near her faint again. Not a sign of entry, not a trace of exit. There's a smear of tallow on the margin, as from a candle that had been set too near. That and a single drop of what might be brine upon the carpet." Holmes's eyes half closed. "Interesting," said he. "That is not the worst," Mrs. Harrow whispered. The constable who was posted outside brought in, not 10 minutes later, a tract he had picked up from the area steps, a printed religious tract of the Society for the Distribution of the Scriptures. On its blank side someone had sketched, in pencil no stronger than a breath, the faint outline of our street and a cross beside our door. As if, Mr. Holmes, as if we had been marked. And before midnight, a man was found in our mews lying against the wall with blood upon his collar. He was not one of our neighbors. He was, I shall dream of his face." "Dead?" asked Holmes. "Barely," Lestrade answered. "And now he has gone past speech. No papers but sailor's hands, sailor's kit, and this—" He drew from his pocket a small round of red wax, impressed and broken. "That was in the fellow's fob. There's a device, you see, though the break spoils it. It might be a sphinx or a lion or some heathen beast." Holmes took the fragment between finger and thumb and held it to the window. The grey day made of it a dull garnet. "Not a beast," said he at last. A figure couched, the baseline irregular, the hint of a palm to the right. "We shall come to it, Mr. Ellison, the tract." The clergyman produced it reluctantly from his breast. Holmes turned it, sniffed at it, and laid it upon the table as one might a patient. "Tallow, sea salt, and a trace very faint of gum arabic," he murmured. "The gum shows the habit of a man who carries his sealing wax to sea. He keeps the wax from crumbling by oiling his kit, and the gum takes the oil. A trifling point." "My husband," said Mrs. Harrow, "was fastidious about such things. He kept his pens as one keeps a sword. But this man, this stranger, why our house? Why our Bible?" Lestrade cleared his throat. "There is a nephew, Mrs. Harrow. You'll forgive me. A certain Jeremy Pike. Debt, cards, a fellow who knows the inside of a police court. He was not present at the reading. He called later, ill-mannered, and was sent away. He is, I am bound to say, absent from his lodgings this morning. Her man in want of money. A rumour of a map, a Bible upon a table, well, there you are." Holmes did not even trouble himself to shrug. "There we are nowhere," said he. "The nephew may be a scamp and yet innocent, as a cat may be a hunter, and yet not the thief of your particular cream. Mrs. Harrow, you have the Bible?" "It is here." She opened a reticule and with reverent hands drew forth the great book wrapped in a wool shawl. When it lay upon our table with its worn leather and its brass corners, such as I remember in my mother's parlour, I confess that a sensation akin to awe passed through me. Holmes stood, bowed to it as he might to an elderly dowager, and opened it with his long forefinger at the place described. Between Ruth and Samuel, there was indeed a faint stain of tallow upon the upper margin, as if a candle set down thoughtlessly had wept upon it. On the carpet beneath, where Mrs. Hudson later swore she had brushed but an hour before, there showed the merest dulling of the nap, like a small star that has lost half its lustre. Holmes bent, squinted, then fetched from the mantel a lens with which he examined the page so minutely that I grew impatient. "Well?" cried Lestrade at last. "Two facts for your pocket, Inspector," Holmes returned, straightening himself. "First, that when the little map fell yesterday, the vellum must already have been varnished lightly along its edges. There is on the leaf where those edges lay the faintest glister, visible only across the grain when one uses a strong daylight. The varnish is of a sort employed by draftsmen who mean their work to resist damp. Captain Harrow was a draftsman. And the second?" I asked. "That the person who removed the map last night did so without touching the centre of it. Observe, the gum on the tract and the tallow on the margin, but the page itself where the map rested is clean of any finger's track. It was lifted by the edges, delicately like a man who has lifted such things before. Your nephew, Inspector, is many things, I dare say, but he is not delicate." Mrs. Harrow's eyes were upon Holmes as a drowning man's upon the shore. "You can help us," she breathed. Holmes's gaze had not left the Bible. He tapped the page with one nail, very lightly, like a tuning fork sounded against a desk. "I can try," said he. "Captain Harrow writes widow, an odd word for a chart. A red cross upon a corner, a tract left like the card of a colporteur. Cur sailor bleeding in a mews with a broken seal, whose device one encounters more often near the Nile than the Thames. A window fastened and yet a thing removed. If this were a sermon, Mr. Ellison, your text would lie before you, but your congregation would fidget unless you promised them a miracle." "We want no miracle," Lestrade muttered. "We want a man in handcuffs." Holmes smiled his thin, wintry smile. Outside, a cart clattered, and the fog pressed its greasy face against the panes. "There is a man in handcuffs," said he, "waiting for us, only that as yet his wrists are free and he does not know we are coming. Doctor, your hat. Inspector, you shall have your tidy skein. Mrs. Harrow, you must return at once and admit no one, not even the nephew, unless he carries with him. Upon his cuff a trace of red wax not older than a day." "Red wax?" cried Lestrade. Holmes closed the Bible and wrapped it again in the shawl. "Because, Inspector, whoever marked that tract last night did so with a seal whose edge is ragged from being broken, and such an edge bites the wax and leaves crumbs. He will carry his crumbs with him. Come, it will not do to keep our sailors' friends waiting." And with that he cast his old Inverness about his shoulders, and we went out into the brown London murk. The sense upon me that we had stepped from a parlour where a Bible lay into a charted sea, whose shoals and crosswinds were known to one man only. We found Porchester Terrace in a state of watchful quiet, that peculiar hush with which respectable streets receive a whisper of scandal. A constable stood before the Harrow house, stamping his feet upon the flags and regarding all comers with the blank aspect of authority. Mrs. Harrow, at Holmes's insistence, went in at once, and we followed her to the parlour, where the great Bible had resumed its seat of honour upon the table, as if it had never lain in my friend's arms. The air held a faint mingling of cold ash, lavender from the hearth-brush, and something keener that brought the sea to mind. Holmes did not touch the Bible at first. He took instead a slow circuit of the room with his head a little on one side, as if listening for a tone out of pitch. He paused at the window, tried the sash, examined the catch with his lens, and craned to the area below. He went to the mantel-shelf. He took up and set down a brass candlestick. He bent upon one knee and inspected the nap of the Axminster, as a gardener inspects a bed where some destructive grub may be at work. At last he knelt beside the table and with a pocket rule measured the smear of tallow we had observed in Baker Street. "It is not a smear," said he, "but a tear, an edge caught and drawn." The drop fell upon the margin only because the candle was carried too near the page. Whoever did so held the light in his left hand and leaned from the shadow toward the book, which was turned slightly thus. A right-handed man may do as much, but the set of the ring, observe the oval dent within the tallow, argues a habit of the left. "Lestrade, your nephew?" "Right-handed," grunted the inspector. "Writes like a spider that has been kicked." Holmes nodded and turned his attention to the carpet beneath the table. "There is our star again," he murmured. Mrs. Hudson brushes with more vigour. "Mrs. Harrow, forgive me, do you employ a charwoman?" "On Saturdays," she said, bewildered. "Her name is Pruitt, sir. She is very respectable." "Respectability is a robe that covers a multitude of sins, madam," Holmes returned absently. "But Saturday is not now. The dulled patch is very small, yet too clean of ash for a house where a fire is laid twice daily. Lestrade, oblige me, where was the wounded sailor found?" "In the mews against the stable wall, 20 yards from the area gate." "And the tract?" "On the steps of the area. We have the constable who found it, Bullen. Send him in." Constable Bullen entered with a huff and a scrape, his helmet under his arm. He was a square fellow with honest freckles and the uncomfortable air of a man dragged before his schoolmaster. Under Holmes's gentle probing, a picture emerged, a shadow moving past the railings between 9 and 10, a short low cough as of a chest seasoned by salt air, the tract upon the steps where, Bullen swore, it had not lain 10 minutes earlier. "You did not challenge the shadow?" asked Holmes. "Begging your pardon, sir, I was at the corner looking after a growler as had taken a wrong turn. When I looked back, the street was as empty as a Sunday plate." Holmes's thin fingers played upon the table edge. "You are an honest man, Bullen, and therefore unfortunate. You have 2 things I desire, your honesty and your boots." At Bullen's start he smiled. "Not to keep, I assure you. Stand upon this sheet of foolscap. Now step off." "Thank you. Watson, our man last night, wore a cut sole that bites at the outer heel. Bullen's tread is plain as print. We must go to the mews." In the chill light we crossed to the stable wall where the sailor had been discovered. The brick still bore the faint shadow of a smear. Holmes drew a little case from his pocket, scraped at the discoloration, and touched the powder to his tongue with an expression of judicial disgust. "Salt," he said. "Not from the road, which gives grit besides, but brine such as you find in a tub where beef has been lying. The drop in the parlour, too. Add to it the oil and gum mixture upon the tract, and we have the habits of a sea chest transplanted to Bayswater. There is also, our wax." He stooped and plucked from a crack between flag and wall a minute crumb of dull red. He laid it upon his nail with the tenderness one gives a rare insect. "Edge is ragged," he whispered, delighted. "As at Baker Street. Our friend cannot open his kit without shedding. Lestrade, when sailors in want of money come up from the docks to trawl the west for a haul, where do they drink?" "Anywhere, Mr. Holmes. Anywhere is nowhere. Somewheres are everything. Do you know a gin shop called the Widow's Palm?" Lestrade blinked. "No." "Nor I," said I, "but your seal, Holmes, the palm beside the couched figure. Just so, Watson. Captain Harrow writes widow upon a chart, and a seal breaks with the hint of Egypt and a palm. To a dull man these are separate. To a sailor who knows that a port leaves its weeds and its words upon a man's tongue, they are of a piece. There is a tavern east of the pool kept by a woman who was called the Admiral's widow in my youth. The house had for its sign a painted palm in memory, so the wit ran of her hand upon her regulars' pockets. Men of a certain stamp call it the widow's palm to this hour. If our friend has sailed under officers who knew Captain Harrow, and I think he has, he would take his tale to that threshold long before he risked a police station. Mrs. Harrow, who had followed us with a shawl about her shoulders, pressed a hand to her throat. Then the map, my husband's map, has been carried to that place. Or through it, Holmes said. Pray return within and bolt your door. Admit no one. And if you see a tract seller with a creased brim and a left-handed set to his bag, send for Bullen. He will know the tread. He clasped her hand very gently, and for an instant the hawk in him softened. Courage. It is a sailor's word, and you have a sailor's share in this. We left Lestrade to telegraph for a man to watch the rear, and took a cab eastward through streets that grew shabbier as the Thames drew near. The fog thinned to a greasy daylight over Commercial Road. A smell of tar, stale spirits, and foreign spices crept through the cab's ill-fitting glass. Holmes sat with chin sunk and eyes veiled, but I recognized in the slight motion of his lips that he was arranging as a chess player arranges the next moves beyond the one he would show. At last he rapped, "The roof," and we sat down in a narrow turning where lamps sagged from. Rusty brackets and a black signboard displayed the ghost of a painted palm above a door polished by generations of shoulders. Within, a dozen heads turned as we entered. The room was low, the ceiling ribbed like an old hull. There were prints of ships upon the walls and a cracked glass behind the counter that multiplied the red noses into a regiment. Holmes did not look at the men. He looked at the floor, at the pitted boards near the door, at the groove where boots had worried the planks. He looked, too, at the shelf behind the bar, where beside the bottles sat among the relics, a lump of red wax no larger than a walnut. "The widow's palm," said the woman behind the counter, with a voice like a boatswain's whistle filed smooth. "What's your need?" "A quiet word," Holmes returned, and laid upon the wood the broken seal Lestrade had shown us. The room's murmur died a note. One of the drinkers, a square man with puckered lids and the bow legs of a man long at sea, shifted his left cuff with an unconscious movement. A smear as fine as dust glimmered there, dull garnet like crumbs of a cherry loaf. Holmes's smile touched only one corner of his mouth. "Our need, madam," he said softly, "is with the gentleman who oils his sea-wax with gum and carries Egypt upon his pocket. It would save time if he bought us all a dram and told us how the widow came to be written upon a dead man's map." The woman behind the counter gave a dry laugh, though her eyes narrowed as they swept from Holmes to the seal he had laid out. The room's silence deepened until even the creak of a chair seemed a provocation. The square-built sailor with the dusting of red wax upon his cuff did not rise but shifted his weight, as a mast shifts before a gale, his hand tightening on the rim of his glass. "I know nothing of maps," he said, his voice low and guttural, as though the sea had worn grooves in it, "nor of widows save the one who keeps this house." Holmes leaned upon the counter with that deceptive languor which concealed the hawk's poise beneath. "Come, my good fellow, you have handled wax seals often, and of late with a stamp whose rim has grown as jagged as a reef. The crumbs betray you, and if that were not enough, there is the varnish upon your sleeve. Varnish such as Captain Harrow used upon his vellum to render it seaworthy." The sailor half rose, then checked himself. His eyes darted to the woman at the counter, who gave the faintest shake of her head. The other men muttered, but none moved. There was a curious sense of all waiting upon some unspoken signal. "Inspector," Holmes said softly, "if you place your hand upon his right shoulder now, you will find he will not resist, for he is not so great a fool as to brawl in the widow's palm. These men respect their house, if not the law." Lestrade, who had hovered uncertainly, took a step and laid his hand firmly upon the sailor's shoulder. The man's muscles bunched like rope under strain, then slackened. He gave a crooked grin, showing teeth as yellow as old ivory. "You'll not take me far," he muttered. "That remains to be seen," Holmes replied. "But perhaps you will walk with us a little way. The night air clears the head." The woman's eyes flicked once more toward the wax lump behind her bar, then back to Holmes with an expression that mingled irritation and respect. "Take him," she said curtly. "But if he returns not, do not set your feet here again, Mr. Fine Detective. This house keeps its own balance." With that, Lestrade urged his prisoner toward the door, while Holmes and I followed. The eyes of the patrons tracked us, silent and unreadable, until the door swung shut upon the fog. In the street, Holmes hailed a cab and bade the driver for the nearest station. The sailor entered without protest, though his gaze remained fixed upon Holmes as though measuring his enemy's depth. As we jolted along, Holmes took from his pocket the fragment of seal and held it before the man's eyes. "You know whence this comes," Holmes said. "Speak truthfully, and you may yet find leniency. Refuse, and I promise you that the gallows will loom larger than you dream." The sailor gave a coarse chuckle. "Leniency from a mind like yours? No, you want the map. That's plain as a lighthouse in fog. Well, I had it. I'll say so. But it's gone now. Slipped as easy as water through a net." "Gone?" Lestrade barked. "Where?" The man shrugged with the insolence of despair. "Handed to a mate whose name you'll not drag from me. The widow marked it, and the widow keeps what's hers." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A mate, you say? And yet your cuff tells me you touched it not at its heart, but by its varnished edge. You feared to spoil what you could not read. It was not knowledge you carried, but merchandise. You delivered it as a child delivers a parcel. Ignorant of its worth, the sailor's grin faded, replaced by a surly silence. At the station, Lestrade left him to the custody of the sergeant, promising to press charges of assault and theft if worse did not appear. We stepped again into the fog. Holmes drew his coat tight and turned his keen face eastward. "Watson, Lestrade, we have taken the smaller fish. The larger yet swims. The Widow's Palm is not merely a tavern but a clearinghouse. Captain Harrow's map is no idle doodle, else why varnish it, mark it, and hide it in Scripture? He wrote widow not to taunt his poor wife, but to point toward this very den. A rendezvous, a deposit, a secret long buried, one cannot yet say. But the second hand now holds the chart, and that hand is practiced." "Then the map is lost to us," I exclaimed. Holmes's smile was wintry. "Not lost, my dear fellow. Only transferred. If one follows a coin from pocket to pocket, one can find it again. So with vellum, we must trace the mark of the widow further. The man who received it will not keep it in a sailor's pouch. He will carry it upward, to a master. That master must have known Captain Harrow, else why covet his sketch?" Lestrade growled. "I'll post men on the tavern till doomsday if need be. We'll see who comes and goes." "Do so," Holmes allowed, "but discreetly, else you fright the bird. For myself, I shall call upon the chart office tomorrow. There are memories in Admiralty drawers that speak more clearly than a drunken tar." We parted at the corner, Lestrade to arrange his watch, and Holmes and I returned by cab through the mist-hung streets to Baker Street. Once there, Holmes threw himself upon his chair and clasped his long fingers beneath his chin. "Watson," he said quietly, "note well the chain." A map sealed and varnished, hidden in a Bible marked with a word that is also a tavern's name. A sailor slain, another caught with wax upon his cuff. This is no common burglary. There is design, and behind design a mind. I must learn what the red cross upon that map signified to Captain Harrow and to the man who now holds it. He closed his eyes, and for a long while there was no sound but the pop of the fire and the distant clang of a handsome bell upon the frosted street. At last he spoke again very softly. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall visit the Admiralty. Tonight I shall think of the widow." The next morning dawned sharp and clear, the fog having lifted to reveal a brittle blue sky that carried the promise of frost before nightfall. Holmes was already astir when I descended from my room. His lean figure bent over a sheaf of correspondence and Admiralty charts spread across the table. His breakfast lay untouched, though the scent of coffee filled the room. "Watson," he said without looking up, "you will accompany me to Whitehall. The Admiralty has granted me half an hour with a certain Commander Briggs of the Chart Office. I fancy we shall not need longer. Precision, as you know, is the essence of my art." I confess my curiosity was piqued. The widow's Bible, the vanished vellum, the cryptic word that was both jest and direction, all had hung like a storm cloud over my thoughts. I was eager to see how a visit to the dry halls of officialdom could possibly pierce the fog that clung about the case. The cab rattled us along streets, alive with clerks hurrying to their duties and milk carts, scattering dogs from their path. When we reached the great grey facade of the Admiralty, Holmes strode in with the quiet assurance of a man who expected doors to open before him. Soon we were ushered into a panelled office where Commander Briggs, a weathered officer with a stiff back and keen eyes, rose to greet us. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said gravely, "we have heard of your services before, though it is not often we apply to private aid. Lestrade's telegram mentioned the name of Captain Nathaniel Harrow. I knew him in the service. A sound officer, though too fond of his independent judgments. Holmes inclined his head. You will forgive the intrusion, Commander. I come not to pry into state secrets, but to seek a fragment of context. Captain Harrow left a vellum sketch, varnished against damp, marked with a red cross and the single word, widow. That sketch is now missing, taken from his house under suspicious circumstances. Before I pursue the trail further, I must know what seas or coasts Captain Harrow was charting when he retired. The commander's lips pressed into a line. He glanced toward the door, then leaned closer. I must be discreet, sir. Yet I can say this. Harrow's last commission before his retirement took him to the Levant, coasts little visited by our cruisers, where older ruins stand half buried in sand. He was attached to a survey concerned with submerged reefs near Alexandria. There was talk that he grew fascinated by certain ancient markings. That is outside the duties of a chart officer. But Harrow was not the first to be lured by history when he should have been taking soundings. Markings, you say? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Might they have formed a map? Briggs hesitated. There was a rumor, unfounded I hope, that Harrow had copied some local plan, an antique chart or fragment handed down by sailors of Arab descent. The Admiralty had no interest. Our concern was reefs and shoals, not treasure hunters' tales. Yet Harrow was stubborn. He sealed his notes, varnished them, as you describe. If he has passed such a map into civilian hands, it may prove awkward. Holmes rose. I thank you, Commander. That is enough. You have told me without telling me precisely what I required. Good day. Outside, as we walked toward the embankment, I pressed him eagerly. Then the map points to treasure. Holmes gave me a thin smile. You leap, Watson, as ever. Let us keep our feet upon firm ground. The map may point to nothing more than an ancient ruin or a forgotten shoal. But the fact remains. Men have killed for it and others are willing to risk prison to obtain it. That tells us its value, whether real or imagined. And mark you this. The presence of red wax and the tavern sign of the widow's palm point to a fraternity of seafaring rogues who deal in contraband charts. It is not the treasure but the traffic in the promise of treasure that concerns us now. We returned to Baker Street, where Lestrade awaited us, his face flushed with the eagerness of a man who believes he has snared the culprit. We've had Pike, the nephew, he announced, under our eye since last night. He was seen in company with a fellow from the Widow's Palm, and this morning he tried to pawn a brass sextant that had belonged to the late Captain Harrow. We've him safe at Bow Street. Holmes only shook his head. Inspector, you are chasing the flicker of the candle while the fire leaps behind you. Pike may be venal, but he is not delicate enough to lift varnished vellum without trace, nor would he know an Alexandrian ruin from a Surrey hedgerow. He is a tool, nothing more. The hand that holds him is elsewhere. Lestrade's brows drew together. Then what do you propose? Holmes paced, his long fingers drumming. We must flush the true quarry. The vellum has passed from the sailor we seized to another, one with knowledge enough to read its marks. That man will not keep it close. He will test it, compare it, perhaps consult others. Such consultation leaves a trail. If you, Lestrade, place quiet men about the British Museum's reading rooms, you may observe who turns to the shelves on Alexandria or Levantine antiquities. Equally, a watch upon ships clearing for the Eastern Mediterranean may prove fruitful. I, meanwhile, will devise a more immediate lure. A lure? I asked. Lure? I asked. Lure? Holmes's smile was cold. A man who covets a map may be tempted by a second map. We shall prepare a decoy, Watson, an imitation of Captain Harrow's sketch, sufficiently faithful to deceive the eye, yet marked with a subtle signal known only to ourselves. We shall let it fall where our adversary may grasp it, and by following that signal we shall follow him. Lestrade sputtered. That's risky work. It is the work the case demands, Holmes replied. Now leave me. Tonight I must become a draftsman. Tomorrow the Widow's Palm shall have another visitor, and we shall see who comes to claim the chart of a dead man. And so, as evening settled upon London once more, I watched Holmes bend over his table with compass, pen, and a pot of fresh varnish. The lamplight glimmered upon his pale features, intent and hawk-like as he copied lines and curves with exquisite care. A faint red cross bloomed upon the corner of his sketch, but within the ink of that cross he mingled a reagent, known only to himself, an invisible sign by which he meant to trace the hand that coveted the widow's map. I knew then that the true test of the case was only beginning. Holmes worked long into the night. His lean figure bent over the table, the scratch of his pen mingling with the occasional hiss of the lamp. I dozed in my chair but started awake more than once, at the pungent odor of the varnish he applied in delicate strokes. At last, when the clock upon the mantel chimed 2, he leaned back, flexed his cramped fingers, and regarded his creation with that same faint smile I had seen upon him when a problem fell neatly into place. "It will do, Watson," he murmured. "To the careless eye it is Harrow's very hand. To the knowing one it is bait. By this time tomorrow the widow's palm shall have swallowed the hook." I offered to watch while he slept, but he waved me off, declaring that his mind was clearer with little rest than with much. When morning came, he was as fresh as though he had enjoyed the slumber of a child. Over coffee, he explained the scheme with precision. "The decoy," he said, tapping the vellum, "will be offered by me in the guise of a sailor in need of coin. Lestrade will post men in plain clothes about the tavern, but at a distance. Hugh Watson will remain near the door to follow should the quarry bolt. Our adversary must believe himself alone with his opportunity, else he will not show his hand." By mid-afternoon we were once more in the squalid alley off Commercial Road. Holmes's disguise was masterly. With a tarpaulin coat, a patch at the knee, and a growth of stubble contrived by some theatrical pigment, he might have been any down-at-heel mariner seeking to exchange sea-worn goods for drink. His gait, too, was transformed, a rolling, loose-limbed stride, as if the deck beneath him still swayed with the tide. Inside the widow's palm, the air was thick with pipe smoke and the acrid reek of spirits. The same square-built sailor we had seen before was absent, but his fellows lounged at their posts, their eyes narrowing at the sight of a stranger. The woman behind the counter polished her glass with deliberate unconcern, though I detected the same sharp flicker of curiosity in her gaze. Holmes slouched to the bar, laid down his pewter mug, and drew from his coat the folded vellum. He opened it just enough for the glimmer of varnish to catch the lamplight. "Worth a shilling to some," he muttered in a slurred voice. "Worth 100 to others. Who'll make it worth my while?" The silence that followed was as taut as a hawser in gale. A thin fellow with hollow cheeks leaned forward, but checked himself as though awaiting a signal. Then from the shadows of a corner booth a man rose. He was better dressed than the rest, no common tar, but a figure of authority. His coat was of dark cloth, his cravat neat, yet his eyes bore the squint of long years at sea. He approached with quiet certainty, and laid a sovereign upon the bar. "I'll buy your trinket," he said in a voice that carried. "Not for what it's worth, for nothing from the hands of a drunkard is worth much. But I'll buy it nonetheless." Holmes's head lolled as though in drink, but I knew by the slight stiffening of his shoulders that he had found his man. He pushed the vellum across the bar. The stranger picked it up with gloved fingers, examined it briefly, and slipped it into an inner pocket. Without another word he turned and walked out into the fog. Holmes drained his mug, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and staggered toward the door. I followed at a distance. Once in the street his posture straightened, the drunken roll vanished, and he quickened his pace to shadow the man ahead. We kept him in sight through a warren of lanes, past warehouses smelling of tar and hemp, until at last he hailed a hansom. Holmes caught my arm. "Quick, Watson! Another cab! We must not lose him now." Our driver was urged to follow, and so we rattled through the crowded thoroughfares, always a dozen paces behind, until the hansom drew up before an imposing house in Bloomsbury, its façade severe, its windows curtained. The stranger alighted, glanced swiftly about, and entered with the air of one confident in his ground. Holmes dismissed our cab and drew me into the shelter of an archway opposite. "You observed his manner?" he whispered. "Not furtive, but assured. This is no den of thieves, but the residence of one who feels himself above suspicion. We are dealing, I fear, with a mind more dangerous than Pike or any tavern sailor. That house will contain both our answers and our peril." He stood motionless for several minutes, his gaze fixed upon the curtained windows. Then he turned abruptly. "We can do nothing by storm, Watson. We must wait. Tonight the vellum lies in that house. By tomorrow its signal will tell us in whose hands it rests. Until then, we must be patient." Reluctantly, I followed him back through the gathering dusk to Baker Street. He said little during the journey, save to instruct me to prepare my revolver. For the matter, as he phrased it, had passed from a game of pawns into a contest of kings. That night, Holmes placed the decoy vellum beneath a lamp, treated with some reagent of his own design. Faint lines glowed where to my eye the parchment had been blank. "So will it shine," he said, "under the same light wherever it may be taken. And there, Watson, we shall follow it." I could not sleep for long hours, my mind turning over the events of the day, the perilous game in the widow's palm, the mysterious stranger of Bloomsbury, and above all the knowledge that Captain Harrow's secret had drawn us into a web whose strands reached further than I yet understood. At last, as dawn crept grey across the rooftops, Holmes stirred in his chair and murmured, "Today, Watson, the spider shows itself." The morning was crisp, the frost still clinging to the cobbles as we set out from Baker Street. Holmes carried with him a small case containing the chemical apparatus by which he proposed to track the decoy vellum. He was in a state of quiet animation, his grey eyes luminous with that peculiar fire which came only when his mind was poised on the brink of discovery. "You will remember, Watson," he said as we walked, "that our bait was marked with a reagent which responds to a certain spectrum of light. Wherever that vellum rests, it will betray itself. It is as though we had slipped a glowing thread into the skein and need only follow it through the tangle." I asked how he proposed to apply the test, given that the vellum was now behind the walls of the Bloomsbury house. He smiled slightly. "Patience, my dear fellow. A house has windows, and a man who believes himself unobserved is less guarded with his treasures. We shall see whether our host has a taste for the lamplight." We arrived near the house shortly after noon, and established ourselves in a discreet vantage from which we might observe its comings and goings. The house was a sober, respectable structure, with polished brass and a neatly swept step, the dwelling of a man of means and standing. A servant in livery admitted visitors at intervals, most of them men of scholarly air carrying portfolios or books under their arms. "Not a den of smugglers, you perceive," Holmes murmured. "A salon of antiquarians, perhaps." "That is worse, Watson. A scoundrel with a pistol is less dangerous than a man of learning, who believes his theft sanctified by knowledge." We waited for some hours, the chill biting through our coats. At last, as dusk fell and lamps were lit, Holmes produced his small case and slipped a curious contrivance over his eyes, spectacles with lenses treated by some tincture. He adjusted them, then gripped my arm. "There," he whispered. "Upper window, second from the right." I followed his gaze. Within, a lamp had been set upon a desk. A man bent over it, his figure partially obscured by the curtain. Upon the table lay a sheet that glimmered faintly, as though it bore a secret radiance. "The vellum," Holmes breathed. "He examines it even now. Mark his hands, Watson. They are not roughened by ropes or stained with tar. This is no sailor, but a man of study." The figure straightened, and for an instant we saw his face in profile. He was lean, with features cut sharp as a cameo, a high forehead, and eyes that glittered with intellectual hunger. Holmes drew in a breath. "Professor Alistair Kavanagh," he said softly. I might have guessed. The name was not unfamiliar to me. Kavanagh was a scholar of the ancient world, known for his theories on lost civilizations and buried cities. He had lectured at the Royal Society, though his peers whispered that his zeal outran his discretion. Holmes's lips curved in a grim line. "A man who has devoted his life to the past, yet does not scruple to steal from the living. Captain Harrow's map points, I believe, to some ruin in the sands near Alexandria. Kavanagh would see himself as discoverer, perhaps savior of that secret. But mark me, Watson, men like him will sacrifice any who stand in their way." At that moment the curtain twitched. A second man entered the room, none other than Jeremy Pike, the nephew, his slouching form unmistakable. He gestured toward the vellum, and Kavanagh answered with a curt motion, dismissive as one waves away a servant. Pike's face darkened, and he struck the table with his fist. Holmes's hand tightened on my sleeve. "Observe, Watson, the rift between tool and master. Pike expected more for his part in the theft. Kavanagh holds the prize and discards the instrument." The quarrel ended abruptly. Pike stormed from the room, while Kavanagh rolled the vellum with delicate care and sealed it in a tube of leather. He extinguished the lamp and vanished from sight. Holmes removed his spectacles. Now the play thickens. Pike will not forgive the slight, and a desperate man is as useful as a loyal one. Lestrade must be told at once. We must have that house watched through the night. We returned to Baker Street, where Lestrade awaited us in no mild humor. When Holmes named Kavanagh as the possessor of the vellum, the inspector stared in open astonishment. Kavanagh? Why, he dines with ministers and lectures before lords. He'd be the last man we'd suspect. Which is why he is the most dangerous, Holmes replied coolly. He cloaks his greed in scholarship. But make no mistake, if Harrow's map points to treasure or secret knowledge, Kavanagh means to claim it, law or no law. You must watch him, Inspector. Post men about his house, but discreetly. The man is clever enough to scent a clumsy shadow. Lestrade grumbled but agreed, and departed to make his arrangements. When we were alone, I ventured to ask Holmes what he foresaw. He leaned back, his steepled fingers shading his eyes. Kavanagh has the map. Pike has the grievance. Between them lies the spark of violence. It may be that the next move is not ours to make, Watson, but theirs. We must stand ready, for the storm will break soon, and when it does, we must be in the very heart of it. That night I lay wakeful, haunted by the image of the map glowing under the lamplight, of Kavanagh's intent face, and of Pike's clenched fist upon the table. Somewhere in the shifting sands of Egypt lay the secret Captain Harrow had carried home. But here in London, in the quiet parlours of scholars and the smoky dens of sailors, the battle for it had already begun. The following day dawned grey and heavy, a mist clinging low across the city, as though London itself were reluctant to wake. Holmes was already pacing our sitting room when I descended, his lean frame taut with energy, his gaze fixed upon the window as though the fog itself carried hidden messages. Upon the table lay his case of reagents, the false vellum now sealed once more in its leather tube. Lestrade's men kept their vigil, he said as I entered, and reported that Professor Kavanagh left his Bloomsbury house shortly before midnight. He went not alone. Our friend Pike followed him at a distance. There was no violence, no alarm, but I fancy matters moved nearer to a head. I have no doubt Pike means to wrest from Kavanagh some portion of what he deems his due. And Kavanagh? I asked. Carried the vellum with him, Holmes replied. That is certain. He values it above all else. He returned near 2 in the morning, his step brisk, his lamp lit at once upon entering. A man who is content does not sit up until dawn examining his prize. Holmes snatched up his coat. We must call upon the widow. She may hold in her grief a fragment of memory that will sharpen our picture of Captain Harrow's purpose. Knowledge, Watson, is the compass by which we steer. When we arrived at Porchester Terrace, Mrs. Harrow received us with red-rimmed eyes, yet with composure. The Bible still lay upon the parlour table, a symbol of her husband's last secret. Holmes approached it with respectful gravity. Madam, he said gently, I must trouble you for any recollection you may have of your husband's habits. Did he speak of ancient places, of Egypt, of ruins in sand? She clasped her hands. Indeed he did, though I scarce understood him. He would sit at this very table and pore over his notes, murmuring of a temple swallowed by the desert, of stones that the sea once touched before the shore sank away. He said it was not for treasure, but for truth. The past speaks, he would say, if only one knows the tongue. Holmes inclined his head gravely. That tongue, Mrs. Harrow, another now seeks to claim. Professor Kavanagh holds your husband's map. We believe he intends to exploit it for his own advancement. The widow's face hardened. Then God forgive him, for Nathaniel trusted that knowledge to no man's vanity. He wished it preserved, not plundered. At that moment a knock sounded at the door, urgent and sharp. A maid entered, pale as linen. Inspector Lestrade, ma'am. He begs to see Mr. Holmes at once. Lestrade came in, breathless from haste. Holmes, we've a stir. Pike has been found. They dragged him from a ditch near Paddington, half beaten to death. He muttered your name and the words, the map, before he lost sense. He's alive, but only just. Holmes's eyes flashed. So the quarrel has turned to violence. Pike pressed too hard, and Kavanagh or his agents silenced him. Where is he now? At St. Bartholomew's, said Lestrade. Doctors with him. He may not last the day. Holmes turned to Mrs. Harrow. You have given me what I needed. Guard your house well. Admit no one, however plausible, until this matter is resolved. He bowed and swept out. Lestrade and I at his heels. At the hospital we found Pike stretched upon a narrow bed, his face swollen, his breathing ragged. His eyes flickered open at Holmes's touch. The map, he whispered hoarsely. He has it still. But there's more. Another wants it. Not just him. Not just Kavanagh. His lips moved soundlessly, then closed as if death had drawn a curtain. Holmes leaned close, his ear at the man's mouth. "What word, Pike? Speak." But Pike only exhaled a rattling breath and sank into unconsciousness. Holmes straightened, his brow furrowed. "Another seeks it. That confirms what I suspected. Kavanagh is not alone. There is a second hand upon the rope, perhaps guiding him, perhaps contending with him. We must discover who." Outside, as we stepped into the clamour of the street, Holmes's stride lengthened. "Watson, recall the tract left upon the widow's steps, marked with the faint sketch of her street. That was no sailor's work, but a careful draftsman's. I begin to think Kavanagh is only the visible face. Behind him stands a society, perhaps a cabal of antiquarians, who covet Harrow's secret for purposes we can scarcely guess. The next move must be ours." Lestrade asked what he proposed. "Tonight we return to Bloomsbury," Holmes said. "We know the vellum lies there. We must contrive to see it once more, for within that red cross lies the key. If Kavanagh has deciphered it, then time is against us. But if not, we may yet forestall him." That evening we took our places near Kavanagh's house. Holmes carried his chemical lamp, the peculiar light which alone could reveal the hidden signal he had woven into the decoy. From the curtained window of the study, there soon shone the familiar glow of lamplight. "There he sits," Holmes murmured, "examining, comparing, perhaps copying. Let us hope he makes his move tonight, for the longer he holds it, the deeper grows the peril." The hours dragged, the fog thickened, and I confess my limbs grew stiff with the cold. At last the door opened, and Kavanagh himself emerged, cloaked and hatted, a case beneath his arm. He glanced up and down the street, then signalled to a waiting carriage. Holmes's hand gripped mine. "Now, Watson." "The game quickens. He carries the vellum. We must follow wherever this road leads. Tonight, perhaps, we sail beyond London's fog into the very sands that claimed Captain Harrow's secret." The carriage rattled off into the fog with Kavanagh within, and we hailed another to follow at a discreet distance. Holmes sat forward, eyes gleaming in the dim light, his lean figure tense as a bowstring. "Note his caution, Watson," he murmured. "He departs alone yet at this hour, and with a case that could hold nothing more innocent than a sheaf of papers. He is not merely a scholar pursuing study, he is a conspirator hurrying to a rendezvous." The hansom before us wound through the streets, turning eastward, always nearer the river. At last it drew up before a building whose dark bulk loomed against the lamps of Southwark. The sign above the door was faded, but I caught the words "The Mariners' Institute," a hall often used by sailors' guilds and lectures on nautical matters. The very air around it seemed to smell of tar and brine. Kavanagh alighted, glanced about and vanished inside. Holmes paid our driver and drew me into the shadow of a warehouse opposite. "A meeting place," he whispered. "There will be others within, and I would wager the vellum is about to change hands." We crept to a side window where the cracked glass gave upon a long hall lit by oil lamps. Within, perhaps a dozen men were gathered about a table. Their faces were stern, their garments sober, but their bearing betrayed wealth and cultivation. Not sailors these, but gentlemen of learning and means. At their head stood Kavanagh, the leather case upon the table before him. One man spoke, his voice carrying even through the glass. "You are certain this is Harrow's hand?" Kavanagh inclined his head. "I staked my reputation upon it. The varnish, the draftsmanship, the notation, it is beyond doubt. With this we may trace the site Captain Harrow discovered, a temple buried for centuries. We shall be the first to claim it, and England shall honour our names." Holmes's lips thinned. "A society of antiquarians," he murmured, "but bound not by scholarship, rather by greed. They cloak their theft in patriotism, Watson, but mark you, it is plunder, no less than if they rifled the widow's home." Another voice rose. "And what of the nephew?" "He may yet betray us." Kavanagh's reply was cold. "He has been silenced. He will not trouble us again." I started, for the memory of Pike's battered form at the hospital returned vividly. Holmes's eyes glittered in the lamplight. "The matter grows darker," he breathed. "We have proof enough for Lestrade, but it will not suffice to arrest them here and now. We must secure the vellum itself." Within the hall the men crowded closer as Kavanagh unrolled the map. Under the lamps, the faint red cross shone where Holmes's reagent lay hidden. Kavanagh tapped it with his forefinger. "Here," he said. "Beyond Alexandria, where the desert meets the sea. There we shall find the ruin untouched and ours to claim." Holmes drew me back into the shadow. He shows them the very decoy. They are convinced it is genuine. Excellent. They will plan their expedition around my sketch, and in so doing reveal themselves at every step. But the danger, Holmes, I whispered. What if they discover the deception? Then, my dear fellow, we must ensure they do not until the right moment. Knowledge is the leash with which we guide them. Come, we must be swift. We stole round to the rear of the building. Holmes produced a small file from his pocket and worked deftly at the hasp of a side door. In moments we were inside, moving softly along a corridor that led toward the main hall. Through a narrow crack we watched as the men debated furiously, arrangements of ships, the hiring of diggers, the division of spoils. Holmes pressed my arm. We have what we need. Their words condemn them, but I must have the map back in hand before we spring the trap. Stay here, Watson. If I give a cry, burst in at once. Before I could protest, he slipped silently through another passage that curved behind the platform of the hall. I waited, my heart thudding, every sense strained. I could see the back of Kavanaugh, bent over the map, his long fingers tracing its lines. Then suddenly there was a faint clatter, Holmes's deliberate signal. I hurled the door wide and charged into the room. The antiquarians sprang to their feet in alarm, some shouting, others attempting to shield the table. Holmes stood at the center, the vellum tube in his hand, his eyes blazing. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the uproar, "your meeting is at an end. The law shall hear of your designs, and this," he held up the case, "shall return to its rightful guardian." A cry went up, and one of the men rushed him. I leapt to Holmes's side, my revolver drawn. For a moment the hall was chaos, lamps swaying, chairs overturned, shouts echoing. But Holmes's commanding presence held them at bay. "Not another step," he warned. "Your conspiracy is exposed. Scotland Yard is already on your trail." At this instant, Inspector Lestrade's men surround the building. Your only choice is whether you meet him in dignity or in disgrace. The bluff was masterly. The men faltered, some sinking back into their seats, others muttering bitterly. Kavanaugh's face was white with fury, but he did not move. Holmes swept the vellum into his coat. "Watson, the door. We must depart before courage returns to them." We backed into the passage, then into the night air, our retreat covered by the stillness of the conspirators within. Once safely beyond the alley, Holmes's stride lengthened, his expression hard but satisfied. "Their society is broken, Watson," he said. "Tonight they have seen that their secret is no secret. They will scatter, quarrel, and turn upon one another. We, meanwhile, have the prize once more. But beware, Kavanaugh is not finished. He is a man who will risk much, and though his fellows may falter, he will strike again. The game is not yet ended." The fog closed about us as we made for Baker Street, the map safe in Holmes's keeping, yet the sense strong upon me that the shadows we had stirred would not easily settle. Holmes carried the vellum tube pressed beneath his arm as though it were no more than a walking stick. Yet I could see by the hard gleam in his eye that he knew full well the danger we courted by bearing it openly through the London fog. We reached Baker Street without incident, though I started at every shadow, convinced that Kavanaugh or one of his fellows might spring from the mist to reclaim their prize. Once inside, Holmes set the tube upon the table, drew down the blinds, and struck a match to the lamp. The familiar glow brought some comfort, though the air still seemed charged with menace. "You played a bold hand, Holmes," I said. "Half a dozen men against us, and yet you bluffed them into stillness." He allowed himself the faintest smile. "A mob of scholars is a timid beast, Watson. They are fierce with pen and paper, but when confronted with the prospect of scandal, they shrink. Kavanaugh alone has the steel to persist. It is he we must watch." He unrolled the vellum, studying it with keen attention. "Our decoy has served its purpose, but we have not yet reached the heart of the matter. Kavanaugh has seen it, traced it, and though he holds no proof it is genuine, his conviction will drive him on. He will not abandon the chase, not while his pride is pricked and the scent of discovery is in his nostrils." I leaned forward, gazing at the faint red cross upon the corner. "But if this is your sketch, not Harrow's original, what hope is there of reaching the truth? Do we not chase shadows ourselves?" Holmes tapped the parchment. "Not shadows, Watson, but reflections. Remember what Briggs at the Admiralty told us. Harrow surveyed near Alexandria, where ruins lie half buried in sand. This mark aligns with the coast as he would have known it. I believe Harrow found some remnant of antiquity, perhaps a temple or harbor lost to shifting tides. The true chart is gone, But by reconstructing his steps and watching where Kavanaugh strikes, we may learn what Harrow meant us to see. In truth, the widow's Bible gave us more than a clue. It gave us a trail, and Kavanaugh is our unwilling guide upon it. Even as he spoke, there came a violent knock upon the door below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's startled protest. Holmes rose swiftly, motioning me to take up my revolver. A moment later, Inspector Lestrade was shown in, his hat askew, his face flushed with urgency. "Holmes," he exclaimed, "there's been devilry. My men lost sight of Kavanaugh after you left the hall. Not an hour later, a watchman near the docks found one of the antiquarians lying dead, strangled, his pockets rifled. The mark of red wax was on his sleeve. Kavanaugh has turned upon his own." Holmes's eyes darkened. "So the storm breaks. He silences dissent even within his circle. The man is ruthless." Lestrade wiped his brow. "We can put hands on him now, surely." "Murder, theft, what more do you want?" "Evidence, Inspector," Holmes said curtly. "At present you have suspicion. Kavanaugh is a man of standing, known in high circles. Without the map in his possession or a witness to his crime, he will wriggle free as easily as an eel. No, our course is clear. We must set the final snare." He turned to me, his gaze bright with resolution. "Watson, you will accompany me to Porchester Terrace. The widow must be warned that her husband's secret is still hunted. And more, she must be our partner in this. Kavanaugh will expect us to keep the vellum close, here in Baker Street. He will not suspect it resting once more within her Bible. That is where we shall hide it, and by watching her house we shall draw him in." Lestrade looked doubtful, but Holmes's tone admitted no debate. Within the hour we were again at Mrs. Harrow's door. She received us with anxious dignity, and when Holmes explained the peril, her face grew pale but resolute. "If my husband's honor demands it," she said firmly, "then place it here. I shall guard it as I guarded him." Holmes slipped the vellum between the pages of Ruth and Samuel, where it had first lain. "Here," he said softly, "the circle closes. And here it shall end. And here it shall end." We stationed Lestrade's men discreetly about the terrace, while Holmes and I took a position within the darkened parlor. The hours crept by, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the occasional clip of hooves upon the distant street. Midnight struck, and with it came the faintest creak of the garden gate. Holmes touched my arm. A shadow passed the window, and then the handle of the door turned slowly, deliberately. The lock held, but a moment later there came the scrape of metal as some instrument was applied. The door swung open with ghostly quiet, and a tall figure slipped within. The lamplight from the street caught his face. It was Kavanaugh. His eyes glittered with the hunger of a fanatic, and his gloved hands moved straight to the table where the Bible lay. Holmes whispered, "Not yet." Kavanaugh opened the book with reverence, drew out the vellum and held it to the faint glow from the curtained window. His breath came fast. His lips parted in a smile of triumph. In that instant, Holmes leapt forward, seizing his wrist in a grip of iron. I was at his side in a moment, my revolver raised. "Professor Kavanaugh," Holmes said, his voice like steel. "The chase is done." Kavanaugh struggled like a trapped beast, his eyes blazing. "You fools," he spat. "Do you not see? This is knowledge beyond price. Civilization's lost. The truth of the ages." "Truth cannot be built on theft and blood," Holmes retorted. "You silenced Pike. You slew your comrade at the docks, and you would have robbed a widow in her own home. Whatever your learning, you stand as common criminal before the law." Lestrade's men burst in at that moment, and Kavanaugh, overwhelmed, sagged in their grasp. The vellum slipped from his hand, falling once more upon the Bible's open page. As they bore him away, Mrs. Harrow emerged from the stair, her face pale but steadfast. She laid her hand upon the book. "It rests here," she said quietly, "where Nathaniel placed it, and here it shall remain, safe from those who would twist it to their own ends." Holmes regarded her gravely, then turned to me. "Watson, the case is closed, yet the sands of Alexandria still hold their secret. Perhaps it is best. Some knowledge belongs not to men who covet, but to time itself." The clock chimed the quarter past, its steady beat echoing through the silent parlor, as though marking the close of a storm that had threatened to engulf us all. The house at Porchester Terrace settled into silence after the tumult of Kavanaugh's arrest. Lestrade, satisfied that his men had secured the prisoner, departed with the grim air of one who anticipates long hours of paperwork before triumph can be declared official. Mrs. Harrow retired to her chamber, leaving Holmes and me alone in the dim parlour with the Bible upon the table, its brass clasps glinting faintly in the lamplight. The vellum lay once more between its pages, a silent witness to the struggle it had provoked. Holmes stood for a time with his hands behind his back, gazing down at it. His expression, usually so austere in victory, bore instead a shade of melancholy. "It is curious, Watson," he said at last, "how men of learning will deceive themselves more completely than the simplest criminal. Kavanaugh clothed his greed in the raiment of scholarship, yet at heart he was no better than a footpad snatching a purse. He believed the map justified murder, but the map itself," he tapped the Bible lightly, "is nothing more than a phantom of a phantom." "You mean your decoy?" I asked. "Precisely." He invested it with such faith that it became to him truth itself. He would have crossed deserts and seas for lines of my own devising. That is the peril of obsession. It blinds even the keenest intellect. I leaned forward, unable to repress my curiosity. "Then Harrow's true map is lost?" Holmes's gaze shifted to the fire. "Perhaps not lost, but buried. Buried in the sands where he found it, or perhaps in the recesses of his widow's memory. Yet what of it, Watson? Should the temple he believed he had marked be uncovered, what would come of it? Another troop of antiquarians stripping relics for their cabinets, another fortune made upon bones and stones. Now the secret may lie where it rests. The widow has her peace, and that is treasure enough." I could not help but marvel at his tone, for it was rare to hear Holmes speak with such restraint, almost reverence. His usual delight in the chase seemed tempered by something deeper, as though the sight of Kavanaugh undone by his own pride had stirred a chord of warning even within that analytical heart. The fire sank lower, and the faint rattle of a passing hansom drifted through the mist beyond the window. At last Holmes roused himself, fastening his coat. "Come, Watson. Our vigil here is done. Lestrade will keep his prisoner, and the widow will guard her Bible. London has survived the theft of many secrets. It will survive this one." We stepped out into the chill night. The fog had thinned, and the stars gleamed faintly above the housetops. Holmes hailed a cab, and soon we were rattling back toward Baker Street. He sat silent, his profile cut sharp against the lamplight, and I knew better than to break his train of thought. When at last we reached our familiar sitting room, he cast himself into his chair with the air of one who has closed the final page of a long volume. He drew from his pocket the small file of reagent he had employed upon the decoy map and set it upon the mantel. "There," he said, "our beacon is extinguished. It has guided us through treacherous waters, but its purpose is complete." I could not resist one final question. "Holmes, do you believe Captain Harrow truly discovered some ancient site, or was it but a fancy?" He smiled faintly, the smoke of his pipe curling upward. "I believe, Watson, that Harrow believed, and in belief lies power enough to move men to perilous deeds, as we have witnessed. The world is full of mysteries, some written in sand, others in scripture. My task is not to judge which endure, but to unravel the crimes they leave in their wake. And in this at least I think we have succeeded." I felt a warmth of admiration, not merely for the keenness of his deductions, but for the humanity that, though rarely glimpsed, underpinned them. He spoke little more that night, but as I closed my journal upon the day's events, I found myself writing with unusual fervor, aware that we had walked not only in the shadow of crime, but also in the deeper shadow of man's endless hunger for knowledge and possession. The following morning's papers were filled with the tale. "Distinguished scholar arrested in daring midnight." Intrigue blared one headline. Others speculated wildly on hidden treasures, lost civilizations, and secret societies of antiquarians. Nowhere, however, did the truth appear in its entirety, for Holmes had declined all interviews, declaring the matter a private one touching upon a widow's peace. Lestrade took the laurels as ever, and seemed content with them. As for Holmes, he treated the affair with an indifference that baffled all save myself. He returned to his violin, to his monographs, and to the quiet puzzles of ashen footprints, as though nothing of consequence had passed. Yet I knew from the occasional glance he gave toward the mantel where the reagent still stood, that his mind lingered on the case. One evening some days later, as the lamplight glowed and the streets outside bustled with the life of London, I ventured a final remark. "Holmes, you called the map a phantom, and yet you pursued it with such ardor. Why?" He lowered his bow and looked at me with that rare smile which softened the hawk's edge of his features. "Because, Watson, phantoms are dangerous things. They lure men into folly, and in their pursuit crimes are born. My business is not with the phantom itself, but with those who chase it. And so long as men do, there will always be work for Sherlock Holmes. With that, he returned to his music, the strains filling the room with a melancholy sweetness. And I, listening, reflected that, though the widow's Bible had closed upon its secret, the greater book of human folly lay ever open, and beside it, ever ready, the mind of my remarkable friend. The weeks that followed were curiously subdued. Kavanagh, though indignant at his arrest, found his protests fall upon deaf ears when confronted with the testimonies of Lestrade's men, the battered body of Pike, and the damning evidence of his midnight intrusion into Porchester Terrace. The law, slow but inexorable, moved against him. His circle of antiquarian conspirators scattered like chaff before the wind, each eager to deny complicity. The widow Harrow spared further intrusion, resumed her quiet life, the Bible once more an emblem of faith rather than peril. Holmes and I sat one evening in our familiar quarters at Baker Street. He had read aloud the last of the press clippings and tossed it aside with a disdainful flick of his long fingers. "London will survive another scandal," he said. "Yet note, Watson, how easily the world is beguiled by the idea of hidden treasure. The mere whisper of a map, even one of my invention, is enough to turn scholars into thieves and nephews into knaves. Harrow, poor fellow, may have sought truth, but truth is never safe once men scent profit in it." I closed my notebook, reflecting on all we had witnessed. "And the original map, Holmes? Do you truly believe it existed?" He leaned back, eyes half shut, the smoke of his pipe wreathing his features. "Whether it did or not is immaterial. The fact is that men believed it did, and in that belief they committed themselves to crime. Harrow's word widow was both pointer and protection, hidden in plain sight, locked within Scripture, where only a faithful hand might find it. Perhaps he knew, in the end, that some secrets are best left undeciphered. The fire crackled and Holmes struck a thoughtful chord upon his violin. His voice, softer now, carried that rare note of philosophy which emerged only when the case was truly behind him. "There are maps, Watson, that lead not to places but to temptations, and sometimes the greatest service we can render is not to follow them to their end but to draw the line where folly must halt." I could not help but smile. "You, at least, will never lack for work, Holmes. So long as men chase phantoms, London will chase you to dispel them." He lowered his bow and allowed himself the faintest chuckle. "An occupation sufficient for any man. Now let us turn to simpler matters. Mrs. Hudson has promised a supper more substantial than our recent fare, and I, for one, find myself disposed to appreciate it. And so the case of the map found in the widow's Bible came to its quiet close, not with treasure unearthed or ruins revealed, but with a widow's peace preserved, a murderer unmasked, and the city once more delivered from the shadows that gather whenever greed disguises itself as learning. To the world it was another tale of crime and consequence. To me it was another testament to the brilliance of my friend, whose mind could trace a thread through fog thicker than London's own, and whose justice, though sharp as steel, could yet temper itself with mercy. Thus I set down the affair as I witnessed it, marveling as always at the singular gift of Sherlock Holmes, who sees where others are blind and who, in a city of secrets, remains its most vigilant guardian.